Welcome and good morning. Welcome to the Greater Boston Chamber's event, Future of Work, focused on transportation. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. At the Chamber, we started the Future of Work series in partnership with our friends at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts to feature prominent experts on the critical topic of how our region's way of work will be temporarily or permanently transformed. New ways of working have certainly emerged and accelerated during COVID, and there are many dimensions to this conversation. But today we're convening to discuss the future of work and the future of transportation. How are we commuting to work today, and how will that change in the months to come? How can we make sure that we have a transportation system that supports our residents and our ability to conduct commerce today and every day into the future? In just a few minutes, I will join transit experts in a conversation, as well as get the perspective from members of the employer community on the future of commuting and our transportation systems, from driving to taking the T and more. Before we get started with our panel of leaders and experts, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page. I encourage you to utilize the chat and the Q&A function during today's conversation. We'll get to some audience questions toward the end. And a big thank you to our sponsor and partner, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, for their support of the Future of Work series. With their support, we're able to make this program series free to every attendee, and I know that today we have a couple of hundred people joining us. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Lindsay Butler, Director of Climate and Health Resilience for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be with you today. As we all know, public transportation is critical to our thriving workforce, but transportation is also the leading contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions in Massachusetts. Traffic-related air pollution, or TRAP, is associated with a number of adverse health outcomes that affect our communities across the state, and these pollutants are distributed unequally in our environmental justice areas. Improving public transportation systems is key to our climate resilience and the health of our citizens. On behalf of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, we are honored to sponsor this series, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's panel. First, we are thrilled to have Joe Aiello, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, joining us today. Joe is an internationally recognized leader in infrastructure development and finance, and as a senior executive with leadership and board roles in government, private equity, and consulting. Welcome, Joe. Next, joining us from Mass General Brigham, I'm happy to welcome Rosemary Sheehan, Chief Human Resources Officer. In this role, Rosemary partners with executive leadership to develop internal growth, expand and build people and process capabilities, create and drive a culture of innovation, continuous improvement, and operational excellence, and strengthens the strategic business alignment of the HR function. Thanks for being here, Rosemary. Also joining us is Monica Tibbetts-Nutt, Executive Director at 128 Business Council. Working in regional planning and transportation, Monica's areas of specialty are transportation planning, urban design, and transit equity. Monica also recently completed her tenure on the Massachusetts Department of Transportation Board of Directors and as the Vice Chair of the Fiscal Management and Control Board that oversaw the MBTA from 2015 to 2021. Glad to have you with us, Monica. And last but not least, leading today's conversation is Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. Under Rooney's guidance, the Boston Chamber has become the leading voice of the business community on public policy issues, weighing in on important matters such as our region's public transportation infrastructure, economic mobility, healthcare costs, workforce development and policy regarding our state's competitiveness. We are honored to have you all here today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to my friend Jim to get us started.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and congratulations to Blue Cross Blue Shield on you joining the team. I know you'll do fantastic things over there, and For those that don't know, Lindsay has done some terrific work related to the water supply. In fact, I think Lindsay co-authored a piece on what happened in Flint, Michigan, if I'm not mistaken. So, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Blue Cross Blue Shield, for your partnership.
Thank you, Jim.
As Lindsay suggested, I'm going to be a bit of a participant as well as a facilitator of this conversation, and I'm going to open by sharing some of my own thoughts, maybe weave in a little bit of provocative questions into the beginning here, and then I'll ask maybe Joe Aiello to start it off. Joe, listen for the questions because they're in there someplace. I always like to begin this conversation about the future of work and commuting by reminding people that by and large, when we talk about sort of issues like work from home, we're talking roughly about a third of the workforce. 2/3 of the workforce don't even have that choice or that privilege. And maybe we'll get into that a little bit later in the conversation when we talk to Rosemary and Monica about the makeup of the workforce. But a lot of conversation, Joe, about the flexibility of work from home, what are companies going to do, big and small. In our membership, I have to tell you, they're all over the spectrum. There's those that are asking or requiring 100% of their workforce to come back to work. There are those, particularly maybe in the small business category, that are being much more flexible. In fact, setting up almost virtual companies and being 100% work from home or work from where you are, whatever the right term is. But the great majority are somewhere in the middle, some kind of a hybrid thing. And my perspective is that I don't know what's permanent. I think we're in a few years of experimentation and figuring out sort of what works. And I guess one of the questions I'd weave in as you think about this, do you agree or how do you see sort of that phenomenon unfolding now and into the future? And you've spent a lot of time. In fact, I would tell people, in addition to Lindsay's introduction, that if I was to put 5 people in Massachusetts in a room to figure out a transportation problem, Joe would be one of those 5 people. But, Joe, as you think about that changing dynamic of the workplace society, how does a transportation planner and a transportation system even get their head around that in terms of providing service today and into the future when there's so much uncertainty about what the workforce is going to, how it's going to behave? And, I've argued, and I've said this publicly before, that sometimes I felt during COVID that, the T needs to be part of the solution. And our public transportation systems have to be part of the solution. But sometimes I felt like they've positioned themselves as part of the problem and, a victim of COVID more than part of the solution to this great return. Traffic is back, despite the fact that, I'm down here in the financial district and, there's these buildings, generously speaking, half full. Not as much vibrancy in the downtown. So even with many of these buildings half full, traffic is back. So before we move on to the employer perspective, Joe, and the business community perspective, give us your assessment of sort of where we are and the capacity and the ability in the short and long term of our transportation systems to sort of embrace the moment and, as I like to suggest, be part of the solution.
Thanks, Jim. And you certainly raise a lot of important questions and offered a good perspective on things. So first of all, I agree we're in a period of experimentation, and it feels sometimes like a middle school science project. And if you don't know if it's going to work when you get in front of the teacher, right? We really don't have any sense of how it's going to evolve. But I think, COVID sent a jolt to the story of how the workplace was changing anyway, gradually over time with more flexibility. But, like any jolt, usually there's an overreaction and a bit of hyperbole. Oh, we're all going to work from home forever and all that stuff. And I think We've gotten over that period, and I think now there's this sort of great sorting out about how to move forward. As to how to approach the challenge in the short term and the long term, let's separate out a couple of variables. You know, when talking about the T, one big challenge they have is the workforce. In just one example, it's very difficult to recruit and retain bus drivers. And that's reflective of what a difficult job that job is. And you and Monica and I could probably do a 2-hour session on the miseries of being a bus driver for a transit authority. And it's reflective of the fact that it's a difficult environment. And that's such a silent backbone of mobility in Boston that's often overlooked, but that remains a crisis. And it's national, by the way. It's not just limited to Boston. The second is that the T, again, in the short term, despite the fact that it's a very heavy fixed asset, very fixed high cost enterprise, where even the slightest drop in ridership has steep financial challenges, and this has been a big drop in ridership. The public doesn't always understand that, and the fiscal challenge has been masked by the availability, thank God, of federal government aid. That's about to wear off. We've got about one more fiscal year of deep operating subsidies. They're going to drop off. And I think as a society, we're going to have to sort of think about, as we are building back society and the workforce, and therefore ridership at the T, there's going to be a period where the organization is going to continue to look like it's in financial crisis. And that's just reflective of its high fixed cost nature. But one positive and one hope about the short term. The first is the positive. And, transit is a generally inflexible industry. You set your schedules, you run the trains, you run the buses. And it's hopeful that a previously entrenched transit industry writ large, but the T in particular, have adopted an adaptability mindset that I think we should all find pleasing. I'll give you 2 examples. One is this runners directed policy. So rather than, because we're not sure how buses are going to, the demand for buses are going to be on a day-to-day, week-for-week basis. So rather than fix the schedules for a whole quarter of the year, they're reserving a portion of the buses to sit in the garage and be deployed on the day or the night before for where we see demand for the product. That's revolutionary in T terms, right? And in transit industry terms. And that really came out of the thinking of the operations folks there. The second is this conversion of a regional rail mindset from a commuter rail mindset. And that is to recognize something that was happening before, but really accelerated. People are just not leaving their homes at 6:30 in the morning, getting on a train, forgetting about life at home, and then getting on the train back. You got most families, two spouses working. You've got care for children, you got care for elders, you've got other things that are distracting. You cannot ever feel that you're trapped and cannot return home in the middle of the day. So the T has now adopted, with respect to commuter rail, an all-day service, clock facing, so you can understand when the next train out to Worcester or to Lowell is going to be. And I think as they continue to add more frequency during the all-day periods, that is going to be that's another example of how they're responding to the changing workforce needs. The second really is a hope and is more of a challenge. And Jim, you pointed it out in your remarks. As a society, and the T is part of society, we have all gone into our shells. We're socializing in person less. We're going out on the town much less. We've cocooned, I guess, was the term that people used to use in the 90s or the 80s or at some point in the distant past. The T lives in that environment. You mean I actually have to sit or stand next to a stranger? God forbid. These are people I don't know. And there's those germs out there. I never saw that there were germs before, but now there's all sorts of germs. It's not just COVID germs, it's other germs. And, I am not kidding. We got to get people recognizing that life is all about managing risks all the time and being careful about what you're doing. But I think there's a particular challenge for the T culturally to be able to connect with human beings in the culture of what the Boston metropolitan area is, to have people say, I am going to choose to use the T because I understand the T gets these things, that I have a heightened sense of concern around a series of issues. I think that's a very difficult thing to overcome. They're working on it, but I think for all of us, even for people trying to get their workers to work in the office, we have to be part of that conversation, and we have to communicate differently, and we probably have a higher bar to pass than others. Longer term, just a couple of considerations, and I'll turn the mic back. It takes a long time to accomplish new things at the T. In 1990, two things happened. One was Bill Weld was running for governor, and he famously said, to the people of New Bedford Fall River, vote for me, and if you don't have commuter rail service by year 4 of my term, don't vote for me when I run for re-election. Well, guess what? It's 2022. We're going to be opening that service in 2023. And that very same year, Fred Salvucci and Mike Dukakis signed the environmental impact statement for the Central Artery. And there were two particular mitigation measures in there that were promised. The Green Line extension into Somerville. It's now opening in 2022. The Blue Line to Red Line connector running down right by Mass General, that's finally going into serious engineering and probably going to get constructed and not completed till 2028, right? So it does take a long time, and we should recognize that. The second thing and final thing is, the future of the T is less about COVID. COVID, at some point, the experimentation will over and we'll settle into a regular pattern. It's more about us and how we as a region are going to move forward. How do we ensure that competitiveness of this region remains vibrant? We're not a static society. If you look back to the 1960s or the 1980s, today you see 3 very different Bostons. We've got to work with you all to anticipate what the Boston of the 2050 is going to look like. And by the way, while we're talking about 2050, there's the crisis of climate change and making sure that the T is working with others to not only invest in resiliency to make sure we can operate despite that threat, but also, as the doctor said in the introduction, Lindsay Butler, we have to decarbonize our own operations, which is a significantly complicated operational financial enterprise. And I think as Monica really tied us together, the MBTA has to be part of the discussion. It can no longer be separated from the discussions about equity and housing. It absolutely positively got to be at the table, and it traditionally hasn't. It has wanted to sort of live in its cocoon. So let me be clear. I think we're in a much better place at the T than we were 8 years ago or 4 years ago. My sense is that the last 2 years, the general manager and the secretary have driven lots of needed initiatives, recruited some good talent, but there's a big lift remains, and to get the T where it needs to be. Boston is a globally premier competitive regional market. It needs a transit authority that meets the same standard. So thanks, Jim. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks for all of that, the comments and wisdom. And I think you probably were more provocative than me. I don't know. But you can get a cup of coffee now while I talk to Monica.
Okay. Thanks.
I want to turn to Rosemary first. Mass General is the state's largest, you can stay on camera, Joe, but largest employer, 74,000 employees. I'm not sure if people are aware of that. And that is across the spectrum, physicians, nurses, scientists, a lot of support staff. Rosemary, let's start with some basics in terms of how I introduce this. How much of your workforce needs to be in a physical place in a hospital or facility, and how much is eligible for a sort of hybrid work from home situation? And what policies does Mass General Brigham have around these issues?
Jim, thank you so much for the question. It's been top of mind, of course, since we sent probably about 40,000 employees to work remotely in March of 2020. And so we have actually been working on what should this look like? What is the future of our workforce, and what does our workforce need to be successful? So where we are right now, we did a pretty significant effort last summer to really understand the needs of the organization. about 25% of our workforce have the ability and are working in a hybrid or full remote status. 75% of our workforce are individuals who really do come into the office. Now, the nature of the work we do means that they're not coming in, many of them, every day anyway. So, our nurses, many of our support staff, many of them work just 2-3 days a week. Some of our physicians have abbreviated schedule. Some of them already did a lot of their administrative work from home. So even those that come into our hospitals or into any of our physical locations, some of them don't come in 5 days a week. So we've always had a very kind of fluid transportation set of needs. And our policies have really been driven to focus on retention and making sure that we don't drive needed talent out. And so we've tried to have a very job-focused discussion. And where we started was we worked with leaders to understand the nature of the jobs. And so we didn't want to say across the board, everyone has to work remotely, everyone has to come into the office. So we started with what is the job of the individual doing the work? And then, and usually leaders have people of the same types of jobs. So they would look at their entire team. They would assess the actual work. Is there customer facing, patient facing? Is it work that can be done remotely? And then that was kind of step one. And we determined what model would be used for that workforce. And then the step two was individual conversations with our teams, with our actual employees. And many of our employees don't want to work, even if they could work remotely full time, they don't want to work remotely full time. So we didn't draw a hard line. All we wanted to do is to be equitable. So if we were providing an opportunity for people to work from home, then all of the members of those types of work groups, like those role groups, should have the opportunity to work remotely. But we also wanted to provide an opportunity to come into the office should the situation make sense for that individual employee. And we have a lot of young employees. They live in small apartments with 2 and 3 roommates, all of them trying to work remotely. It's very difficult for some staff to actually work full-time remotely. And so they actually love coming into the office, even if they could work from home. So we've tried to have a real balanced approach, and it's really been focused on employee engagement and retention. That's been our key focus. But we still have a massive workforce, as you know, that takes care of our patients, that ensures that our hospitals are clean, that our patients and employees are fed, and doing science or doing work in labs where you have to come in. So we have to create the type of, and we need from the state, transportation that meets the needs of those employees as well.
Rosemary, if you put a heat map on Boston in terms of like traffic, I'm sure that Longwood Medical and over Cambridge Street would sort of glow a little bit from time to time.
Yeah.
You mentioned all of the workforce, but you've got patients, visitors as well. Any sense of how people get to those facilities? I mean, commuter, public transportation, driving.
So I think from our employee perspective, the parking situation is so challenging that a lot of our employees do actually take public transportation. So it's really critical that we have effective round-the-clock access to public transportation, both commuter rail as well as the T. From our patients' perspective, we do have some patients come to our hospitals leveraging public transportation, but they come from far and wide, and really they're concentrated. The majority of our employees, about 55% of them, work within, probably a few mile radius. So very concentrated in Eastern Massachusetts, in Boston. And so our patients come from a significant distance. Many of them travel from all over the state and other states. We tend to see very high driving and parking in our parking garages. And I think the traffic that everyone experiences often is patients and visitors coming to our hospitals, and not just our employees, because they mostly come on shifts, right? You see a lot of turnover during certain parts of the days, but throughout the day, those are our patients and our visitors who are coming to our hospitals. And so a lot of them are still driving. I don't know if there were better options during the day for patients and visitors to come to our facilities if they'd leverage them more. We've never actually polled our patients and asked them that, but I think that would be a worthwhile conversation to have.
I want to switch to Monica, and a lot of these conversations, I'm guilty certainly of focusing on downtown Boston and its activity centers in terms of the commutes to the financial district, the hospital districts, the South Boston waterfront, even Kendall Square and so forth. But 128 is an important sector of our economy. Monica, you lead the Business Council of 128. Before I get into some questions about commuting, tell us about the companies, the range of industries, and maybe a little bit about how do people get to and from work who are in your membership companies?
So we're a pretty big mix, but I would say the majority of our companies either fall into the life science companies or they fall into technology companies. We do have some financial services. So we really do range as far as what sort of commuting patterns we're seeing. Initially, everyone just worked from home. All of the life science companies, except those of them that were working on the vaccine, basically halted all operations to try and figure out how are we going to get people back. But I would say in the last 12 months, it really has been planning for what is that new normal. And so for a lot of the life science companies, manufacturing, research and development have come back at much greater rates than we've seen their office staff, facility staff. With manufacturing in a lot of our industrial sector, they've never been able to truly stay from home. And so when you're seeing a lot of that traffic on 128, that's where a lot of it is coming from. And then with the technology companies, it tends to be a younger workforce, tends to be a lot of programmers, a lot of engineers, and the majority of them have continued to work from home. And when we're talking to our members, I think initially we were thinking, okay, you would have different types of schedules, people coming in 2 days a week, 3 days a week, which you do see at a lot of our companies, but some of the technology companies have gone completely remote. And some of them have no intention of ever coming back. And I think that, as I said, is very reflective of the age and the type of workforce that we have. But I think the portion that we haven't really been able to address really is the life science companies. Because despite all of this, they're continuing to grow, continuing to expand their campuses. And beyond that, anyone that pays a lot of attention to land use and permitting, a lot of these office permits are now being switched to lab space. A lot of projects that were initially developed for office, residential, multi-use are now being switched to lab space. 128 has been having issues with congestion since the early to mid 70s, and we just weren't built to handle this much lab development, this much life science companies. And it's going to be very interesting to see not just how the MBTA is going to respond to this, but how are companies like ourselves who are closing those first last mile gaps, how are we going to be able to be responsive to this new workforce? But I would say the majority of the life science and tech companies, what they're doing now is going to be what is permanently in place, I think, especially at least for the next 5 to 10 years.
Monica, talk a little bit. You mentioned the traffic on 128, but talk a little bit about what public transit options exist. I mean, the T is built as a sort of bring people into Boston system, right? So what are the public transit options for people in your membership?
We don't have a significant amount of them. The Business Council has been closing these gaps since the 70s. Our major hubs that we connect to, Alewife Station being the largest, and then connecting with Waltham Center for commuter rail and some bus service, and then Newton Highlands as you're getting down into the Needham area. But all of those subway lines just stop. They stop with 10, 15 miles still left to go to get to those economic engines. And for us, it's been running those bus services. Beyond that, there aren't really any great options. You know, as Joe talked, we have commuter rail stations, and they've started to be much more responsive to needing to operate throughout the day. But for us, it really is frequency and access to those commuter rail stations. If you look at a map and just kind of draw it out, the amount of commuter rail stations that are just so close but not quite there is massive. But then you're also dealing with a workforce that needs to actually get into work at varied hours, especially now, and being able to line that up can be very, very difficult for a lot of people. And that's before you even get into the discussion of the cost of using commuter rail. And that cost, even in a state like Massachusetts, where it is very expensive to drive, it is still significantly cheaper to drive than to come from one of those outer line stations. So we really kind of are in an island of our own. And, like I said, with the shuttle buses, we're able to actually close that gap. But as Joe had mentioned, those services are getting harder to operate. And it's not just from a financial situation, much like the T, it's from an operator situation. We cannot get enough operators. We have been very lucky that we have not had to close service because of it. But a lot of these municipal bus services, a lot of these other shuttle bus services are having to stop running service for a week or two because there just aren't enough people to actually move those buses. And I think that puts especially regions like 128 in a very difficult position to continue closing those gaps over the long term.
Yeah, I think what has happened in 128 belt in terms of the local business community supplementing what government public transportation offers with shuttle services. We're seeing that more and more. Of course, we saw that during the development of the South Boston waterfront, for example, where at one point there were about 20 different shuttle services independently operated by companies themselves were running around the South Boston waterfront. So I think that's probably part of the future, given the fixed nature of the T. And as Joe said, the long time it takes to try to address that through our public transportation system. I want to stick with Rosemary and Monica for a minute and, weave in this issue of the workforce. And, Rosemary, you said that, you try to listen, you try to communicate with existing employees about sort of what's in their minds about coming into work and so forth. And certainly one of the things I've heard is that this phenomenon that's going on of asking people to commute back to work. So during COVID, when they didn't have to come into work, they didn't have to spend that hour in the morning and that hour at night. So, having a cup of coffee at the kitchen table instead of getting on the T, or being able to, put food on the stove or go to the yoga class or whatever at the end of the day. Now they're commuting home. So it's almost like you're taking something away. And I'm wondering, Rosemary and Monica, how much you're hearing of that type of dynamic. But looking to the future, so that's the current. Yeah. You both and your companies are in the recruitment business. How much is the commuting factor a part of the conversation when you're talking to prospective medical professionals or tech professionals out in the 128 belt? So multifaceted question. Rosemary?
So it's a significant problem for us. So what happened when we all went to work from home is people just worked more. So most of our teams were able to just increase productivity significantly. So as we bring people back into the office, what we're trying to help managers understand is it has to be a recalibration of expectations. And I noticed it myself. Today I happened to be working remotely. Tuesday I was in the office. Tomorrow I'll be in the office. The days that I commute, I feel completely behind all day because I would use that time in the morning to actually play catch up. And then the end of the day, I would do the same thing. So I think, but how people are feeling is really varied. It's quite individual, Jim. We have people who actually, the joy of being with people and getting out of their homes outweighs the commute. For some, where the commutes are very long, that's where you see people being less willing or less anxious to come back. The way we've managed this is created a hybrid situation. So people feel, and I talk to a lot of employees who say, at least I get to go in 2 days a week, but I still maintain my work-life balance more effectively 3 days a week. And we're trying to say, when you're in the office, the key message we're trying to convey is when you bring employees back into the office, it should be for meaningful collaborative events. Like I'll just use myself as an example. There are days where I will go to the office and I'm on Zoom from 7 to 6. And I never leave the actual space and I don't see other human beings. There's very little benefit to having a 2-hour commute in the morning and the afternoon, an hour in each direction, to just sit in your office and see no one. What I think we will, so then the risks or the negatives of the commute do not outweigh the benefits, because it's very little benefit to coming back. I'm hopeful that as Omicron now settles back down, that we'll start to see more people come back into the office. And what they're trying to do is actually, as teams, pick days that they can be together. And that's where then they feel like, okay, I have to commute, but wow, I had this terrific day where I actually interacted with humans and we got a lot done and we actually moved things forward. That's when I think if they're actually having good days in the office, they'll want to be in the office more. But to go into an office when no one is there, there's just no joy in that for the employee. And so therefore the commute doesn't seem worth it. So it's a complex issue, and the commute, by the way, was the number one thing that was raised when we did our survey of our employees last summer. Commute was the number one reason they enjoyed the remote work. That was absolutely by far the number one issue. And it cut across all demographics. It was not a millennial issue or a boomer issue. It literally cut across all demographics. They all felt that way.
I was on mute. I'm usually reminding other people. Monica, perspective from your members and what they're hearing from employees about this sort of commuting phenomenon?
Very similar. The biggest issue we've always had with recruitment and retention in the 128 is the commute. It is brutal. And especially since very few people, almost no one, has the ability to live near where they work in much of the Commonwealth. But I think especially when you're talking the 128, there just is not enough housing supply. And so very similarly, I, like many people, just used to going into the office. I've gotten used to my commute over the 12 years that I've been doing it. I'm oddly very calm. I like my audiobooks, like to read, so it doesn't usually bother me. But the second I no longer had to do it and realize how much more time I have, as Rosemary said, to actually do my job, it just really didn't make sense to ever go back 5 days a week. And quite honestly, at this point, meeting with my staff, there's no way they would ever go back 5 days a week because it just doesn't make sense. And I think when you're talking about the work-life balance, this is actually probably the first thing that we've done that really moved the needle on trying to increase that balance for people. But then also, as Rosemary said, the collaboration and the meaningful time that you are in the office. We are all in the office together for staff meetings because that is the most important thing we can do, or team updates. But beyond that, we all work from home because most of the meetings are on Zoom, and most of the meetings just quite honestly don't need us all in the same building to have them if we're working with outside people. People will not come back 5 days a week. I never, ever see that happening, ever.
I agree.
Yeah, you will never be able to get employees. No one's going to want to do that. We all know we still can't get employees under these circumstances, but it will never happen. And I honestly am not sure that it should.
Yeah.
When we talk about equity, I think we talk about income a lot of the time, but the other thing we don't talk about are parents or people with disabilities or people who are taking care of parents or other family members. It has always been a burden on those groups, and they weren't able to put in as much work. And now they're able to. They're now able to live in different places, work in different places. And I think this has actually made the workforce incredibly equitable and has really pushed us more in that direction. And I think now it really is looking at, okay, how do we just reestablish what work looks like across the board, independent of industry, to start having the discussion about what transit do we need to be putting in, what housing initiatives do we need to be making to be responsive to this new landscape of workforce.
Well, thank you both. And Joe, your rest is over. As we talk about these issues and these challenges and the changing dynamics of work, resources are necessary. I mean, as we try to shift to the solutions bucket, we're in a period of time in which there's a significant influx of federal monies into Massachusetts in the form of the infrastructure bill. Joe, I mean, you were very involved in transportation for many years, served as chair of the control board, and Monica was vice chair. So I'd like to kind of go around and talk about how do we given your perspective on this subject matter, how do we best prioritize the use of these federal dollars so that we're not looking back 10 years from now and saying that we knew the challenges, but we missed the opportunity? How do we approach that? Joe, you want to kick it off?
Well, I think it's helping the T reposition. And I think there's a little bit about also helping the T to become a bit more productive with the tax dollars that it does receive. So let's talk about the one place where it intersects both, and both Rosemary and Monica just touched on this, and that's the commuter rail system. We run the commuter rail system today the same way we ran it in 1955. So on a typical train out to Worcester, there is the engineer who drives the train and typically 12 conductors who do what they did in 1955, which is they punch tickets to make sure you paid your fare. They open the doors because automated doors weren't invented yet in 1955. And sometimes I feel like they may not have been invented yet, but I know they exist in San Diego and Germany and a whole bunch of other places. What it requires for that to change and to move to what probably should be a third of that staffing is investment. It's investment in level platforms. It's finishing off this new fare collection system and deploying it. It's buying new equipment to be able to do that and running the proper schedules. Monica talked on the fact that, I think, Jim, you mentioned it as well, commuter rail / regional rail is way too expensive for a lot of people. There needs to be something done about that. One of the impediments is that is because of the manpower that we have there, it is a really unnecessarily high cost system. If we can drive down the cost point, we could then drive down the price point. If we could further introduce means tested fares, then those who are really forced to move farther away from their jobs because of the cost of housing at least can be mitigated by the fact that we're not punishing them for that longer distance that they travel. I'll hand it over to Monica, who I think has thought about this stuff much beyond where I have. Monica?
Regional rail, I think, is really quite honestly the biggest thing that we need to focus on. I think it has the biggest impact for the Commonwealth as a whole. But I think the frustrating part is there is going to be a significant amount of federal funding. But I think with so many different states competing for it, what Massachusetts is going to have to do is have more shovel-ready projects, but also have much more defined goals around particular projects. Whether that's regional rail, whether that's focusing on additional funding for first, last mile gaps, that's what is really going to be needed. And I think it's going to have to be a collaboration, not just with transportation, but with housing and with economic development. If we don't start building in housing concerns into a lot of these transit projects, which I think this discussion around regional rail has, I think it's going to be very, very hard to be competitive in getting these funds. Because the last thing I think anyone wants to see is doing the same old projects the same way that we've always done it, purchasing the exact same equipment that we always have. As Joe says, there are many, many innovations that we can take advantage of, but I think it really needs to be thoughtful and we need to be ready when those grant programs come out. And then I think the other major thing is really focusing on climate change. So not just focusing on getting more people on transit, but focusing on providing that transit in a much cleaner manner than we are now. Battery electric buses, talking about how we're going to build the infrastructure for all of this charging, working with the energy community to make sure that that infrastructure is part of these programs. Because the other thing is, beyond your traditional transit, we can actually build infrastructure to make those changes, but we need to be ready for it. And we need to have those partnerships already built before we try and go for that federal funding. But I do think housing and climate change needs to be at the forefront of these conversations when we're talking about taking advantage of, really quite honestly, this once in a generation opportunity through the infrastructure bill.
Rosemary, largest employer in Massachusetts, what's on the wish list for use of these funds?
Well, I actually agree with Monica. You know, the reason people have long commutes is they've had to push way out. So they can't afford to live near where they work. And so they're not going to want to come into the office. And then those who have to are essential workers. It's a very unequitable system. And so I think that's probably top of mind for us. Housing is a significant health equity issue as well. So we're really concerned about the ability for not just our employees, but also our patients to have appropriate housing at affordable rates. And then I think for us, it's going to need to be flexibility. I think people are going to live and work everywhere. They're going to have really flexible work models. They're going to come in half days. They're going to come in one day. Next week, it's 4 days. And I think that's hard for the T and the state to respond to, quite frankly. But I think we have to realize that we've opened kind of Pandora's box. We're never going back. So we have to adapt to this new way of working and new way of living, quite frankly. And I do worry about what happens to just the cities where people used to come and spend a lot of time. I worry a lot about that, because we're anchor institutions. We're going to be here. So what happens to the neighborhoods around where we are if we don't have a lot of people coming in? What happens to those businesses? And so, of course, we're worried about that. But I think from a health equity lens, it's housing. That's our number one issue.
Well, you were very diplomatic in not putting in a plug for the Blue Red Line connector, so I will.
Well, thank you. That's a
very necessary project.
Yeah.
It's about time that it gets built, and Joe mentioned the engineering is picking up, but I hope that it gets on the funding plan as well. So
yeah.
So I want to, just stick with this issue of housing and pricing, which you each have introduced. And I'll tell you, from our perspective, wholehearted agreement. When you think about professionals, young families, couples thinking about their housing choices, the ability to afford a mortgage and where they choose to live, and they're going further and further out. But, there was a time when you looked at, can I afford the mortgage payment? Now you sort of have to, can I afford the mortgage and commuting payment that goes with the mortgage payment is part of the calculation on where you live. And Joe and I were sort of in the room when sort of some of these distance-based schemes were brought up, and they made sense at the time. But I think we'd both agree that while they were right at the time, they're probably wrong for today. And it's time to revisit it and just put a plug in for a piece of legislation the Chamber is advocating for, to create a mobility pricing commission to take a big step back and look at the options to price and create incentives and disincentives in our mobility behavior, and to deal with these equity issues, both social equity, geographic equity. I don't know if this is true, but Joe, you mentioned Fall River, New Bedford, and if you play out the distance-based fare system, I think the commute into Boston will be $15 a day if we continue along the path. I don't know if that math is right or not, but it'll certainly be very expensive. And I don't know who's going to do that or who can afford to do it. And if we want people making different housing choices, we have to think about it. So from my perspective, over time, a lot of inequity has been built into the pricing of transit, the pricing of consuming mobility, both social equity and geographic equity. It's time to take a step back. Monica, you mentioned some of the environmental issues we're trying to incentivize. What we do historically is we lurch from financial crisis to financial crisis. The T is going to fall off a cliff in 2 years. How are we going to fix it? Or, we need to pay for something, gas tax, tolls, it's crisis to crisis. So we're going to be working hard here at the Chamber to try to get this in play. I want to switch to a couple of audience questions in our remaining time, some of which you all have anticipated. I'll start with you, Joe, because I know that during your time as the head of the T's control board, you brought in a nationwide panel of experts to look at safety on the T. There is a question in the chat about attracting people back and the confidence people can have in the safety in the system. Your perspective on, I can get a safe, reliable ride on the T as people judge their commuting patterns going forward.
Sure. That panel did a terrific job, and certainly we, and Monica was deeply involved in this as well as my partner in this, gave them unfettered access to the entire organization. And they did a deeper dive than I think anybody ever has on safety procedures and safety culture. And it was a very, very disturbing report. And, you know, we're not going to get to perfection immediately, but I can tell you this, Steve Poptak and Jeff Gunnerville have done an amazing job of just refocusing everybody's view on the priority of safety and what it means in a safety culture. They recruited the top safety officer out of Chicago CTA, which has a stellar reputation, Ron Esther. He himself has brought in additional talent. So, you know, they're working their way through this. And I would just say, the T every day gets a bit safer, and I think it's going on an accelerated pathway. You know, we'll continue to see, unfortunately, some of the you know, the hangover from the vast number of things that have to be cured for. But I like the direction, I like the pace that is heading into. Monica, I don't know your perspective on that.
I completely agree. I really do. I think they're in a much better position than they have been in a very, very long time. And I think that the riders can feel much more comfortable on the system than they have been able to before.
You're on mute,
Monica, I want to stick with you for the next question because you raised the issue of electric vehicles in the one of the audience questions is about the future of electric vehicles and particularly in public transportation.
I think it's an infrastructure concern, and I think this is something we don't talk about. Everyone just wants us to buy battery electric buses, wants people to buy electric vehicles, and quite honestly, the infrastructure as it currently exists cannot accommodate that. And this is moving beyond just talking about bus maintenance facilities. It's also talking about municipal facilities. A lot of these commutes, you know, as we talk about, especially into the 128 corridor, are very, very long, which means we need much more battery than we would if we were talking about just operating within the inner core communities. But even if you have those buses, there's absolutely nowhere to charge them. And so I do think it has to be a coordinated effort in looking at bus maintenance facilities, but also looking at the stations and allowing school buses, et cetera, to be charging at these larger charging infrastructure stations. But it is going to be a significant amount of investment in the grid, and it needs to be a significant amount of coordination amongst the service providers, the agencies, and the municipalities themselves. So really, once again, it's not the most interesting part of this. Everyone likes the really cool buses, but it really is the stuff that is going to make it possible for us to actually operate these fleets. And that has to be dealt with before you can start purchasing large fleets of these battery electric buses.
Maybe one of the priorities for some of that infrastructure money we talked about earlier. Rosemary, I think the next question is something you can address, and it deals with sort of the generational differences. You certainly have people across the generational spectrum in the workforce. And, you know, the question is, you know, are you seeing differences in perspective on wanting to get back to the office and sensitivity to some of the issues that we've talked about? The person who posed the question, for example, raised the issue of the challenge of networking, team building, creating culture, and so forth. And I know that Monica spoke about that earlier. But Rosemary, what are you seeing and hearing on the cultural, the generational differences?
Yeah. So when we surveyed our workforce, we didn't see generational differences in almost any question. Now it's not to say there aren't differences. They just aren't clean cuts across generational lines. I think it's much more individualized to where you live. That's like one of the biggest ones, how far out you live from the workplace. And I do think that there are some young people who would prefer to be in the office and be networking more effectively. So I personally, as the head of HR and the mother of 3, you know, young adults, I do worry about the impact on our young people. I actually am concerned about having our young people never be in a full office environment where they're learning and watching and seeing how people interact and building deeper relationships. And that there's a lot of learning that comes out of that. And I do worry about that, but we actually do see a lot of our young people enjoy the remote work because they can go to yoga, they can do all those things that they can fit in around their schedules. And you have to remember, they're very used to being on digital tools. So it doesn't bother them to be on Zooms. They feel like they're connecting with people because much of their lives are like that too, their personal lives. So it's not purely generational. We've not seen that yet. And I think it's very individual and just personal to the individual. You could have someone who's a Gen Xer who's actually caring for a sick parent and coming into the office. They may want to, but it's so much easier for them to be able to navigate those issues at home. You know, obviously having young kids and needing to commute an hour and get them to their dance lessons, really challenging as a parent. So I think it's more the what else they have going on in their lives, Jim, versus just pure generational differences. Yeah. Now, of course, that's anecdotal, but the data that we have from the survey did not highlight any differences. They all felt the same way about the commute. They are, somewhat concerned about building relationships and culture. And we've tried to do other things to really build that, but it is hard. I think it is hard to do that well.
Joe, I'm going to ask you for a quick answer to this question that's in the chat. You mentioned the cost structure of the T, and the question is around the inflation factor as it relates to sort of the T and what it does. It's not a static cost environment. It's affected by all of the same inflationary pressures. Can you speak to that in terms of T finances?
Yeah, certainly. Just take one example, the cost of diesel for our locomotives and buses is through the roof. Now, the T typically hedges that stuff for a multi-year purchases, but they're always rolling off contracts and coming back in. So that's just an example of that observation. Yes, absolutely impacted by the inflationary pressures we're seeing. Vehicles are costing more, parts are costing more, supply chain issues are affecting us. Another part of that same equation. We live in the same world with everyone else. Yep. Yeah.
I'm going to wrap it up. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask for a less than minute answer to this. We've got a campaign for governor coming up, and we've talked a lot about the needs of employees, of employers throughout the Commonwealth as it relates to this notion of the future of work and the role that transportation, particularly public transportation, plays in that. So why don't we do Rosemary, then Monica, then Joe on, your hope for what might get discussed during the campaign as it relates to this topic and transportation in support of a thriving economy and our workforce.
So I mean, there's so much that I would hope would get discussed, everything we've talked about here, climate change, affordable housing. But I'm really hopeful that they'll discuss the future of work, that it just is not what it was in the past, and how the governor will really think about adapting the transportation infrastructure to respond to the needs of our current workforce. And then I couldn't end by not asking them to consider various fare structures to support equity. So I think that has to be part of the discussion as well. So those would be my 2 top asks.
Monica?
Quite a bit of that, actually, but I think also really looking at transit-oriented development and starting to look at the way that we are approaching land use and housing around our transit centers and actually building in the housing components into transportation planning and really making that solid connection from the very beginning. And as they're building their platforms, as they're building their initiatives, making sure that they are taking that into consideration. In addition to economic development, as Rosemary said, we need to understand what this workforce needs. We need to understand what the residents of the Commonwealth need, because it's not going to be a discussion anymore of people moving sector or moving portions of the Commonwealth. It's going to be moving outside of the Commonwealth. And that is going to need to be addressed very early on for us to actually be able to remain competitive in this market.
Yeah. Joe, the 1-minute version of what you're going to tell the gubernatorial candidates when they call you.
Go run for the hills. I don't know. No, I think it's more of a sum up of what you all have been saying. Right here are the 5 big things. I think competitiveness of the region all around jobs and economic growth, equity, mobility, climate, housing. They can no longer be stovepiped. They have to be resolved and secured together through a coherent policy. The question for the next governor is, how do you effectuate that when you have a state organization and municipalities that are typically stovepiped? I think that's the big challenge.
Well, a very special thank you to all of our panelists, Rosemary, Monica, Joe. A great conversation. I could go on and on, but we're out of time. Appreciate all of your dedication to the Greater Boston community and lending your wisdom and insights to a conversation like this. A big thank you to our partners at Blue Cross Blue Shield for their sponsorship of this program. And as a reminder, on March 3rd and 4th, the Chamber's Pinnacle Awards will take place, at which we will celebrate the achievements of women in the business community in particular. This is one of our signature events. It'll be live at the new Omni across from the Convention Center. And I hope that you'll consider joining us for that event. You can find out more about that and other chamber events at bostonchamber.com. Once again, thank you to our speakers today and to all of you who have chosen to join us, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Jim.
You take care.